And one final topic we have, this of course everyone's favorite lately, the scooters, dockless bikes.
Have you ridden one yet, Karen?
I have not.
You have not?
I
Okay,
will
all
fully
right.
admit I have not. But the board has taken almost a year now to really study the use of these scooters, the dockless bicycles, and come to some conclusions and are moving forward. Where are we right now?
Well, on this one, I think we've all described it a little bit in the meetings, but just to be clear, Virginia law does not allow us to ban scooters.
Right.
And I think that needs to be resaid because that has not always been the coverage of this. And so Virginia, the legislature this past year said that starting January 1st, there will be a lot of flexibility if localities don't act.
Okay.
So this is the first step in a two-part process. Next month we will fully consider and act on the final piece of the process. But this is our staff and the county board discussing what are the right limitations and what's realistic and what do we want as far as enforcement, because there's certain things that we cannot do under state law. In addition to banning, we cannot, for example, require the use of a helmet. And so
Even though you should use a helmet.
You should always use a helmet.
Right. Absolutely.
But,
So
but it cannot be required.
we had a discussion, heard a lot of feedback, and we had a discussion about what the parameters should be of those limitations and where we can sort of work together to make sure that, for example, you focused quite a bit on spaces for the scooters to be docked, because that's the sort of thing that can help change how scooters are being used, and we have an ability to help there where we might not have the authority to ban, et cetera. So,
what were some of the more interesting things that came out of this study? Like, what did you find that perhaps didn't surprise you overall, but what did you find that were kind of interesting little tidbits?
Well, I'll tell you, one thing that shocked me was finding out that among the 500,000 trips which have been taken in Arlington, the average length of the trip in terms of miles was a little more than 9/10 of a mile.
Really?
And my initial thought was,
Quarter mile, something like that. That's what I would have thought.
and I also just thought, well, why aren't people walking? But then as we dug into the data a little bit more, we found that people weren't using these to replace metro trips or bus trips. These were replacing these were creating trips that wouldn't have taken place otherwise. So people were using it to maybe go do something that's a mile away, maybe a little bit too far for them to have just willingly walked to, and they're just making supplemental trips. So it's really got an interesting niche, and that kind of surprised me a little bit, especially when I looked at the average amount of time that it takes, because the time was like 14 minutes to go a little less than a mile, and I'm thinking you can walk it that quickly. But hey, they're serving a role, and so it was exciting for me that they're not cannibalizing trips on transit and in other ways that wouldn't be beneficial for us. But the fact remains, given, as Matt said, we can't ban them, this study was really all about how to have these work harmoniously in our community. And I know we're not going to please everyone, but there are some things that I think we can do to make it so that our sidewalks don't become the wild, wild west, that these don't just become street litter, and that we recognize that in a community of walkers and cyclists and drivers and scooter riders, people who have easy mobility, limited mobility, perfect vision, limited vision, we've got to think about these things holistically if they're going to work well.
and I think it's important to say that we're going to focus on safety to the maximum extent that we can, but there are other technologies that have come forward that initially we have all been very wary of, and making sure that we keep focused on safety. This can really help with that last mile, and if you think of the reality of the months of July and August, or December and January and February, when there's not snow and sleet, this is a chance to help with transportation that I think can have a role. And as long as we focus and make sure we're strong on safety and take some of the practical steps that I was alluding to earlier, I think that this is something that we can work with.
And again, it's just kind of consumer education of using common sense while we're all sharing the road together.
Indeed. And, I will say that, we've looked at data in terms of crashes and all of the things that I think people usually get concerned with scooters. But as I've heard from people who do use them a lot, I have very much been convinced that this is not just people who love the whimsy of getting on something that reminds them of being a kid. It's actually serving a real need. And let's not forget, battery powered, zero emissions. The more we can have this sort of thing in our community, the better. It's our job to make sure it all harmoniously works together.
I mean, 5 years ago, we probably wouldn't have ever thought these would become
Unbelievable, right?
have the place they have in our community. Who knows what's next?
Sure. Well, I think it's also good that the team that's been taking in this data has included the police department throughout, which is key for safety purposes. And I think that's part of what will set us on a good, we'll consider it at this upcoming meeting and will set us on a good foot as we move forward.